Welcome back to our church history course. This week, week 5, we'll be looking at the centuries between the end of Roman Britain and the Norman conquest. So we've had 4 weeks where we've covered about 400 years, and this week we're going to be covering about 600 years. So obviously we're going to be selective. When the Roman army left Britain, well, actually they didn't leave. What happened was the Roman Emperor told Britain to look to their own defensive, and most of the people who were stationed here at the time stayed. And so we have a Romano-British country, British but heavily influenced by that experience of almost 400 years of being a Roman part of the Roman Empire. And Christianity was the official religion. It had been for about 20 years in the Roman Empire. It had been permitted for another 80 years beyond that. And as we saw last time, it had spread quite widely. Worship of other gods, what we tend to call paganism, from the Latin pagus, meaning countryside, never entirely died out. So local Celtic deities were worshipped by some, God through Jesus by others, and some people probably worship both for good measure. Gildas, who wrote in the 6th century, wrote a book called The Ruin of Britain. He spoke about waves of invaders coming from the north of Europe, Angles and Saxons. British leaders, under pressure from the Scots, who are from Ireland, remember, and from the Picts, who are from Scotland, engaged the Saxons as mercenaries to defend them. Gildas tells us the Saxons did their job and then stayed, and in time the leaders took over the lordships of the areas. In later years, mainly actually the 19th century, this was expanded to come up with the idea that when the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, Bede tells us about the Jutes as well, came, they either killed or pushed out the people who were living in the land that would become England. No, that's not true. Some migrated west, but most stayed. And it's likely that the new lord were not too bothered by what the locals worshipped, so long as they paid their taxes. So Christianity continued as the religion for some, but it was now without official support. Now, it may have meant that British Christianity lost some of its connection with European Christianity. According to Francis Pryor, in his book Britain AD 2005, the archaeology certainly doesn't support the idea of a major migration. There's no sign in the pollen record of a major break in cultivation, which is what you'd expect if the British had been cleared out. As he says, the point that arises from this is obvious, but needs making nonetheless. This diversity of land use shows an extraordinary degree of adaptation to contrasting landscapes and soil conditions at precisely the time when Anglo-Saxon settlers are supposed to have been colonising the landscape. I believe it would have been impossible for large numbers of migrants to have adapted so fast and so thoroughly to such diverse conditions. If there actually were any incomers, they must have been few in number and have settled within existing communities. It's also worth stating that secondary woodland will start to develop very rapidly once a farmed landscape ceases to be maintained. The process has already started in parts of upland Britain where sheep farming is no longer possible. Within 1 or 2 years, hawthorn and sloe bushes appear, followed swiftly by birch. Close on the heels of the birch trees comes the true forest trees, oak and ash. If the process is rapid today, it would have been very much more so in the early Saxon period, when introduced species such as grey squirrels, muntjac deer, and rabbits were not around to nip off the growing shoots or ringbark the young trees. Once an arable field had been abandoned, scrub would have colonised it in about 5 years. Secondary birch or elder in wet areas, woodland, would soon grow up through the briars and bushes. the field would have become an almost impenetrable thicket within a decade. The absence of such scrub and woodland regeneration, by the way, he knows about that because of the lack of pollen from those species, is very significant for what it tells us about the East Anglian landscape in the early 5th century. DNA studies have shown the same sort of thing. If you look at these slides, you'll see that even DNA studies of people done recently shows that only 20 to 30% of their DNA has come from Northern Europe rather than from prior DNA that was brought here at the end of the Ice Age. There's also evidence that in certain areas the culture, and with it the Christianity, was surprisingly resilient, even in the face of change by rulers in nearby areas. For example, Lincolnshire has the presence of an Anglo-Saxon culture that's marked by cremation burials, as opposed to continued inhumation burials, where you bury the whole body. As you'll see from this map, they're all at a distance from Lincoln itself, and those distances are about 15 to 20 miles. Indeed, the name Lincoln comes from the shortening of Lindum Colonium to Lincoln, so it retained its Roman name through this. And the Lindum of Lindum Colonium is actually a pre-Roman name, probably from the word pool, dark pool. That pool is known as Brayford Pool now in Lincoln. You get a similar pattern around St Albans in Hertfordshire. Indeed, in much of the British Isles, there was still a clear Christian culture. In the west of the Isles, this is seen in the form of inscribed stones. Sometimes they have Latin inscriptions, sometimes Ogham. That's a form of writing developed for writing Irish, probably in the 4th century, probably in response to Christianity coming to Ireland and bringing with it the idea that you write things down as opposed to remember and pass on just by word of mouth. And sometimes we find stones with both texts on. Such stones are to be found in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, Devon, but very, very few further east. They're evidence that Christianity was alive and well in the west of the British Isles. But why weren't there such stones further east? Did it mean Christianity really got destroyed there? Hence no stones? Perhaps there's another reason. Geology. In the east, the culture of marking graves with stones did not develop, probably because chalk really isn't very suitable for that, and clay certainly isn't. So perhaps they made markers of wood, and we just don't know because they've rotted away. But there is other evidence of survival of Christianity in the East. It's to be found in the graves and also under old church sites. One such site is in the fort of Vindelandia. Here, during the period of the 4th to the 6th century, 3 different chapels have been unearthed, and in one of them, this lead chalice, the Vindelandia chalice, was found in 19 different pieces. On it you can see scratches. The scratches include a Cairo, a bishop with his hat, a fish. That's distinctly a Christian piece. Other places, there's evidence of continued use of church sites, no longer being repaired in stone, but with repairs and new build in wood. It's something similar you find to many sites in the east where stone is no longer particularly used, but the wood, which was abundant, is used. In some graves you find items that are particularly significantly Christian. Hanging bowls have long been something that nobody quite knew what they were for, but if you examine the escutcheons, the decoration on them, over 70% of them have a Celtic style decoration which shows water or the Trinity. Some have clearly crosses on them. These have either been found in graves or in church sites. And of course, we have the continuation of people being buried with their heads to the west, their feet to the east. Another aspect of graves is the orientation of the graves. At Mucking in Essex, in the 6th century, there were clearly two cemeteries which were used at the same time. One, the one you can see below, has the graves at all sorts of angles and also has cremations in there. The other, the smaller cemetery, has the graves pretty much west-east. Looks to me like there was a Christian community as well as an incoming community. In Kent, we see that nearly all the graves are west-east, 92%, and there are very few cremations. Kent seems to have been pretty much a Christian community in this period, which is probably unsurprising given how close it is to France. Francia had been solidly Christian for at least a century. Another very significant grave was discovered in the 1980s and excavated. This is the grave at Prittlewell in Southend in Essex. It's the Prittlewell Prince grave, and you can see there was some amazing artifacts found there, including a hanging bowl, metal ends for horns, and those two crosses. They're not very big, but they were placed over the eyes of the person who was buried. Clearly this was a high status person, hence being called a priest, hence being called a prince. And yet they had crosses, gold crosses on their eyes. The contents of the grave have been dated by the horns. The organic matter there dates to around about 580 AD. So it's very likely that this grave was dug, this stuff put in it, before Augustine came to Canterbury. During this period, Christianity continued to thrive in Western Britain and particularly in Ireland. We had wonderful teaching communities in Ireland, and those communities sent back towards the British Isles their missionaries. And so it was Colmcille, known to us as St. Columba, came to Iona to be his base for evangelizing into the Pictish regions, founded his community there. The monastery that Columba set up in Iona was to remain a spiritual stronghold for a long time. From here, Aidan came in response to an appeal from the King of Northumbria, Oswald, in 635. Oswald had gone to Iona while he was in exile. The very going to Iona rather implies that if he hadn't been brought up a Christian, he certainly was very open to Christianity in those years. Anyhow, he invited Oswald to come up. So he invited Aidan to come and set up a monastic community, which he did on Lindisfarne, and that became Aidan's monastic see. Oswald's successor, Oswy, took on ownership of the English, the Britons, the Picts, and the Irish Scottish people by much fighting. In all his kingdoms, he promoted Christianity. And so Christianity spread with this Irish flavour. Or perhaps it was renewed with this Irish flavour. In 585, Gregory, who was to be Pope Gregory I, saw the English slaves in the market in Rome and famously was reported to have said, "Not angles, but angels." He set off on a mission to these islands, but was persuaded to stay in Rome and was made Pope. But he never forgot, and so in 956 he set another party, including Augustine, to do the job for him. This party was nervous about the task and tried to turn back once, but Gregory sent them on. He gave them letters for all the bishops and Frankish lords that they would meet on their way, asking for help and protection, assuring the bishops that there was no intention of undermining their leadership by this party coming from Rome. The Frankish bishops consecrated Augustine as a bishop before he went to England. He landed in Thanet and sent a message to the King of Kent, Ethelbert. Ethelbert kept them waiting a few days, but afterwards invited them to preach to him at his court in the open air. Decided to let them stay, gave them lodgings in Canterbury with permission to preach. Timing was actually quite good for mission, because Ethelbert's wife Bertha was a Frankish princess, a Christian, who had her own personal bishop with her. Within a year, Ethelbert converted, gave Augustine a bigger place to live, and encouraged others to convert. He also gave Augustine a church, St. Martin's in Canterbury. Now, Bede, writing in the 8th century, claimed that this had fallen into disuse, but others have argued it was Bertha's private chapel. Indeed, the medal of her chaplain was found near. Her chaplain, who was a bishop, was found near, and that favours this interpretation. Ethelbert, as one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxons of his day, could then influence other kings, so Augustine was free to preach at other courts. King Sagbert of the East Saxons was converted, this is all according to Bede, which enabled Augustine to set up a bishop at London. Gregory directed the mission from afar and sent Augustine the authorization to call himself a metropolitan, an archbishop of a larger area, with London as his see. However, things broke down in relationships with the East Saxon rulers who controlled London. The king was a Christian, but his sons weren't, so Canterbury became the metropolitan see. Augustine appealed to Gregory for reinforcements. More men were sent, including another priest, and they brought with them vestments and Augustine's pallium, the sign of his authority as an archbishop. They also brought orders from Gregory to destroy pagan temples. However, a month later, Gregory had reconsidered and wrote, "I've decided after long deliberation about the English people, namely that the idol temples of that race should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols in them. Take holy water and sprinkle it in these shrines, build altars and place relics in them." Bede tells us that while Augustine was doing this, there were British bishops who were not too sure about what was going on. Gregory encouraged Augustine to meet them. However, the Roman mission came with an assumption of their superiority. They'd been sent by the Pope. The British bishops were unsure how to receive Roman visitors. And when they met, it was clear they had differences, in particular about when to celebrate Easter. The British asked for a second synod where more bishops could come, and they took the advice on how to tell if Augustine was a man of God. A wise anchorite suggested they should tell by watching how he greeted them. If he rose, he was humble. If he remained seated, he was haughty. Augustine, sure of his role as the Pope's envoy, remained seated, unaware of the test that was set. The Christians who had maintained the faith for over 4 centuries, with their own giants of faith in David and Ictid, that's Lantwick Major, where he had his monastery, resented these newcomers and would not agree to work together. Now, Augustine took this as a sign the British were schismatic, refusing to accept the Pope as the head of the church. When he reported to Gregory, Gregory encouraged him to be open to different ways of doing things in different areas of the church. But Augustine had already made it clear that he believed the Roman way was the right way. In the following years, another metropolitan see was set up in York, and that's the basis of our 2 provinces of Canterbury and of York. Augustine brought with him a copy of the Gospels, which is now to be seen in Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. You can look on the internet because their collection's been digitised, and you can see the Augustine Gospels there. The 2 traditions were evangelising the Saxons and Angles, sometimes working in the same area. The Roman mission converted the king of Northumbria, as we've heard. And eventually, Oswy, the king of Northumbria, saw it was necessary for the two traditions to be reconciled. The two main points at issue were how to date the celebration of Easter. How baptism was administered was also an issue, although that's not one that gets talked about a lot, and what the shape of the clergy tonsure should be. All were actually symptoms of something else. Which was the better tradition? The British claim their tradition went back to St. John. The Romans claimed theirs went back to St. Peter. Which tradition was more authoritative? On that matter of the tonsure of St. John had the front of the head shaved from the line from ear to ear, all the way back there. If you look at the sculpture which I found in Sompting Church, this probably shows it. They tended to wear their hair long at the back and it was shaved at the front. And you see that particular bishop seems to have his hair clear at the front. The Roman tonsure is the one that we're used to, with the hair being shaved on the top of the head. King Oswy eventually came down on the side of the Roman way. Probably he saw advantages to being allied with the continental church, and his wife was from Kent and was following the Roman custom. But it was still up to each king in his kingdom to decide which tradition to follow. The deciding point, I think, in this story comes a little bit later, when Theodore of Tarsus is appointed by the Pope to be Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, usually popes are quite happy to accept whoever was the local suggestion, but in the mid-660s there had been plague, and the candidates for Pope had died, and so for Archbishop of Canterbury had died, and so the Pope decided to send his own man in. Theodore had been living in Rome. He was from Greek extraction, but he'd learned his Latin. He becomes Archbishop, and while he's there, he writes his penances. It's a book called Penitential. It contains all the penances you give for particular infringements. But for being a British Christian, it's more than a penance. So he says, on the communion of the Irish and Britons who are not Catholic in respect to Easter and the tonsure. Those have been ordained by Irish or British bishops who are not Catholic with respect to Easter and the tonsure are not united to the Church, but they be confirmed again by a Catholic bishop with the imposition of hands. Likewise also, the churches that have been consecrated by these bishops are to be sprinkled with holy water and confirmed by some collect. Further, we have not the liberty to give them, when they request it, the chrism or the Eucharist, unless they previously confess their willingness to be with us in the unity of the Church. And likewise, a person from among these nations, or anyone who doubts his baptism, shall be baptized. So he basically excommunicated the British Church. Theodore made it clear the British and the Irish were not proper Christians, since in his view they weren't part of the unity of the Church. However great and however holy their people may have been, they couldn't be proper saints because they had not become Roman Christians. So churches dedicated to them weren't accepted. They needed a new dedication, usually to a universal saint. So the apostles and Mary were mostly used. Such men as Aidan, Boisil, who had taught Cuthbert in his youth, Cedd, the younger brother of Chad, all died as part of the British Church before the Synod of Whitby, and their cults of those saints were suppressed. They couldn't quite suppress the cult of Oswald, because he died fighting a pagan and was seen to be a martyr, and Cuthbert too managed to survive this cull. But otherwise, the Celtic saints of the east of Britain were lost to history, their church taken over by those who accepted Roman ways.